Hello, friends, to a podcast with interesting people. Today we have Kathy Mann, a book author that's going to be one of our guests. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about her background before we start. Kathy Mann is a writer and speaker with an interest in stress management and wellness. She is passionate about guiding people towards their best life possible through her workshops, talks, and writing. Kathy is a champion for living with passion. She believes in spending your time in work that inspires you. She believes in living up to your potential and harnessing all your innate talents. Welcome, Kathy. How are you today?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing well, thanks.
So, Kathy is joining us from Johannesburg, and so we're hoping that technology is not going to fail us again. So that we get to talk about your book and about stress. You wrote a book, Harnessing Stress, which I almost finished reading, and it's a phenomenal book that brings together a lot of resources, a lot of research, and a lot of information from a variety of different sources. This is your second book, as I understand it.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the first one was about burnout. What made you write
Yeah.
this second book, and tell us a little bit about what's happening in the space of stress nowadays?
Yes, I think the first book I wrote was really about my personal experience of developing an illness from stress. And that took me by surprise because I was living quite a healthy life. And I thought that people needed to learn that that is possible and to help others not to experience the same things. But then there's a 2 year gap between the first book and the second book. And the transition is quite interesting because when I wrote the first book, I felt very much like I needed to warn the world about the dangers of stress. And within those 2 years in the process of writing the second book, Harnessing Stress, I learned to actually value and appreciate stress and to use it really as a tool for living a better life. So that's what the second book is really about. It's about sharing that message that stress can really help us reach for our dreams and it can make us into better people if we just learn how to appreciate our physiology. So that's really the gist of my story.
How was the process of researching this topic? There's a lot of resources out there, and you cite just all the top authors in the space, researchers in this space. Putting all this together must have been a really huge undertaking. And also you probably wanted to carve out like a specific angle that you have on this. And, the way I read the book is that it just kind of connects with your own life story and how that affected you and, the experiences and the, lessons learned that you got out of that. Tell me how writing this book changed your life right now, and how was the process of actually putting all of this together?
Yeah, I think, it sounds like a big undertaking to read all of those other books and extract the nuggets and put all of that research in. But really, it's pretty much a way of life for me. And it's like a hobby. I read a lot. All of the books I read are really about personal growth and how to be a better person and how to build a better life. And that's just my passion. I'm fascinated by that. And I think I got there because my life broke. It broke so royally that my health was completely in a state of collapse for several years. And in rebuilding that, I didn't want to leverage off my own knowledge and advice because I clearly had no clue. I wrecked it so badly. So I wanted to really lean on the experts, the international experts about how do you live a happy life? How do you create a life of joy and using research-backed science to get there. And so that was really it. So I pretty much devour these books on positive psychology, on how to embrace stress and how to build resilience. And I love that stuff. It really feeds me. So it's just really part of my everyday life. And then when I come to writing the book, all of a sudden in one of the chapters, I realize, oh yeah, I read that part about grit and how that's relevant. And then I weave that in. So it's kind of at my fingertips because I love this topic so much. Yeah.
I, as I was reading the book, I was laughing to myself that, how many different tools that you use that are like how I think about. Like you use mind mapping, uh,
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, okay, we're on the same page. How to research all these different interesting research papers and other books, and how to cite them, and how to connect all of this, so it's to kind of paint a whole picture for your readers, and so I really love that. And what
Thanks.
were some of the most surprising, I guess, things for you as you were researching this and interviewing people for this book? What were some of the surprising things that you've learned about
I
stress?
think I think the most noteworthy thing is that we're all struggling. And I did a lot of interviews. I interviewed everyday people that I came across. And I found what I was very moved by is the fact that everybody is struggling. There's a history in everybody's life about some sort of a trauma or a difficult event or an adversity. And that really changed me, I think, in learning that so many other people are struggling. I had this enormous health collapse, and I thought that I was the only one who'd really been so affected by stress. And then I discovered all these other people, and they carried it with such grace. I spoke to all these people about childhood abuse and all these difficult experiences, and yet they were so positive about life, and they still just carry on regardless. And that was really meaningful for me. And I think there was beautiful things also in the research that I found meaningful. Things like the fact that singing and chanting has an effect on our well-being, which is quite fascinating to me. These funny little nuggets that I picked up, it was really interesting. I gained so much from the process of just reading into and reading up about my topic. So there was so much that I learned, and it really did change me. I think it created a happier person, and I moved to a happier, more positive place by the time that I delivered the second book.
One of the things that were for me as I was reading your book, you've mentioned different approaches to stress. You talk about the sources of stress, understanding stress, and what are the lifestyle changes that that one can take, the stress management approaches, and it's very comprehensive. I just want to just tell the viewers and listeners to this show that the job that Kathy did, like putting all these different things together, it's like this is like an encyclopedia of research on stress, because she cites a lot of different authors, and she talks about very tangible things. You get bullet points that talk about specific aspects of how to deal with stress, and then contextualize it with stories and feedback from people that share their stories, how they deal with stress. And so you get all these different perspectives, which I personally can appreciate, because a lot of times we get books which are great, well researched, but they are very like monotone in a sense of like one sense of approach, one angle. Your book is drawing on research from many different sources, from many authors, and you address things that are body and mind and spirit, all the things that affect us. You think about stress, you typically think of those like top 3 stressors, but then there's just so much more that affects us, right? And
yes, I really believe in a holistic approach, and a lot of people have asked me to write about how did I heal, how did I recover from that process of burnout, how did I get to the other side. And I think there's a future book in there somewhere. But my real belief around that is that it is holistic. And I've noticed that there are people who are very much polarized. They either just take medication and do nothing else. And then there's others that believe, they just want to do the spiritual healing and things, and they don't want to take the doctor's advice. But frankly, for me, I think, the holistic approach of tackling everything, tackling your lifestyle, your beliefs, your diet, the way you think about things, your relationships, all of it has an influence on our stress. And I think if we learn to be a little bit more holistic and incorporate many different aspects, I think that's the most powerful intervention in learning really how to get on top of our stress.
so what are the top? Let's talk about the top stressors. You cite work, relationships, and what else did we have in there?
Money.
And money, naturally.
Yes. Yeah. So in terms of the research I did an online survey that was about 300 people. And I found that the top source of stress was work. So that was 77% of people cited work as a source of stress. And then in second place was money. And I asked about two different components of money, and that was daily expenses, struggling to meet the everyday costs, as well as the concern about saving for the future, having enough money for retirement. And both of those money issues came up in second place. And in third place, relationships came up. And I asked about stress, a source of stress on a variety of levels of relationships. And the top two were relationships with spouse and with children. So that was very interesting for me.
In terms of work and work-related stress, it seems that, and again, this is just my opinion, it seems that there's a lot of people out there which are unhappy at work, which adds on to their stress. What are some of the things that you recommend or you research that work in kind of coping mechanisms for those stressful? Because it seems like there's just a lot of people are just like unhappy with their work and they're just miserable, and
Yes.
how can they survive and cope with that stress?
Yes, I think there's a couple of things. And obviously, it goes without saying that doing the work that you love creates a lot more happiness. So if you can align your work with your strengths, or if use a way to incorporate your strengths into your everyday routine, then that would help quite a lot. So there's little methods of, if you're good with people, spend an extra 10 minutes a day following up with those customers, and use the parts of you that are valuable and bring them into the workspace as much as you can. One of the researchers talks about something called job crafting, which means that you can, if you have the flexibility, depending on your job function and how it's designed, if you're able to almost massage your job function into aligning with your best attributes. So those are the kind of things. And then I think also on the relationship side, it's also about taking accountability, owning your part. So if you arrive at work and you're in a bad mood and you grumble at everybody, well, you're not really going to have a good day. So if you're able to embrace show your best self, do your absolute best at work, then, you're likely to perform better and get better opportunities. So there's a number of things you can do in the workspace to make your job a little bit better.
It sounds like connecting with something that you are really into and connecting that to the work role that you perform is the winning ticket to kind of staying motivated, staying engaged, and
Yes.
pushing forward. There's a lot of other. Your book is replete with different tactics and methods, and some of them are the usual suspects that everybody obviously you have to get enough sleep and you have to eat right and you have to
Yes.
exercise. But you have some of the things that were surprising to me were, which makes sense, but you might not think about it. Like sometimes when you are close to being burned out or you are burned out and you're like, well, I'm going to work out and get some of that stress out. That actually may be a negative thing, right? So tell me more about
Yes.
that.
That's right. So the stress hormone cortisol is released when we're exercising in an extreme way. So I know all about this because I used to be an ultra marathon runner. So it means I used to run 6 days a week and long runs on the weekend. And when I started to become very ill, I just kept running because I thought, well, I need to stress bust, and exercise is a good method of doing that. But actually, the additional cortisol was actually harming me because it was really exacerbating all of the stress-related symptoms. So it would be my recommendation that if you're feeling quite close to burnout, then more gentle exercise is required. Walking, something like swimming that's quite good for you and combat stress. And maybe if you're very close or you are burnt out, then maybe exercise is not what you need to do right away. You just need to rest a lot more, which is quite hard to do if you're quite an A-type personality and you like to be achieving and driving all the time.
Right. It's interesting how all these different elements that you can bring in to help you with dealing with stress. One of them that you mentioned is meditation. Again, something that people will be like, oh yeah, everybody will tell you like, yeah, just go and meditate. How is your? Were you always meditating, or did you? Was that a practice that was this a practice that someone you said like, well, you should probably try that How did you come about meditating?
Okay, well, when I got so sick, I realized that, my stress was obviously quite out of control. And I then realized that this is something I need to learn. This is a skill I need to start to master to be able to calm myself down and really benefit from it. And there is a lot of research showing that it actually, even in as quickly as 8 weeks with daily practice, it can actually change the structure of our brains. So it actually has a really significant impact. And what I did was I dabbled a lot. And what I'm always quite clear on is I don't have everything figured out. And I tried apps and they didn't work. And I tried a bit of YouTube and I wasn't really convinced. And then eventually I went on a training course. So that was a one night a week for 8 weeks. And then we had homework. So we had to meditate every day for 20 minutes as part of the homework. And that really embedded it. I think once that practice took hold and I saw the difference in me, I was a different person really beyond that 8 weeks. A lot more patient as a mother and a lot more calm. And my days just went smoother. So that really sold me on the process. Then I realized, I'm benefiting from this. I can feel it. And that motivates you to keep going, which is, I think, the hardest part of meditating. We start it and we think, I don't have time for that. Or that's a bit boring. I want to drop it. But I did feel that. And it was really important given the state of my health at the time.
Another thing that I really liked about your book and what you were saying in it is how it's not only like it's not a single-minded topic like the stress. You connect it to all these other things that are related to it, and one of them is habit formation. How do we how do you get out of this, right? Because we can all intellectually read a lot about different methods and techniques, but it's all about implementation, isn't it? Right? It's
Yes.
how are you going to put that in your daily life? So like yes, we know that we need to eat and sleep and write and meditate and work out and all of that stuff. But how do you make it so it sticks? How do you make that a habit?
Yes.
And so you talk about that in your book. Has anything changed? Like what are you doing now? What were you doing before to kind of form these new habits and stick with them?
Yes, I think for me, obviously, for most people, they don't have the strong catalyst or the trigger to make these important lifestyle changes. But for me, that I became so sick, I really had to learn how to do these things. So I think underlying all of the changes I made, I really felt compelled to do it for my own benefit. And the changes I made is I have a green smoothie every morning. So now lots of greens, things I'm growing in my garden, and avocado and seeds and things. And that fills me up in the morning. So I do that every day. And I do miss it. If I go on holiday, I come back and I feel a little less healthy, and then I resume it because I can feel I'm getting the nutrition early on. And then I think exercise for me is really key. I feel great once I've exercised. So I try to maintain about 2 or 3 days a week of yoga at least. And that makes me feel great. I feel so good after a class that I really feel motivated to do that again. And then in terms of sleep, I think I really fight for my sleep now. My husband is quite an insomniac, and he drives me nuts because he sits in bed and he's reading his book and he's got the light and it's shining at me. And so what I do is I even have these earplugs that I put in to drown out his extraneous noises. And I have an eye mask that I put on, so I block out all the light and the noise, and I get to bed on time, and I try to get as solid night as possible. It doesn't always work, and I have patches where I don't sleep that well, but I do my best to fight for a good night's sleep.
One of the things that I found in my life is that when you don't get enough sleep, it just everything else just goes down from there. It's basically like you don't get enough rest, then you're gonna overeat
Yeah.
because then you need that energy. You need to feed
Yes.
that body, that gap that you created with not having enough sleep to rest and recover. It basically just
Yes.
creates a vacuum that then you fill in with all those bad things, and then that perpetuates in turn
Yeah.
other things, right? Then you're like, oh, now I'm gonna do.
Yes.
Now I feel bad, so now I'm gonna watch some movies or something to get into the some
Yes,
of
it
those
spirals.
right,
Mm.
and so
Yes,
that brings me
it
to another
does.
thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So what I was wanting to say is that it does also have really significant health impacts. And I think what happens in society is that everybody wants to be so busy, and a lot of people brag about how little sleep they're getting. But, I like to brag about how much sleep I'm getting. I'm telling people, now it's holiday time for us. It's our summer. So I'm getting 8 or 9 hours a night, and it's fantastic. And I think the focus on and how I feel, I just feel like $1,000,000 when I wake up with a fully rested night. It does absolute wonders for your cognitive function, your memory. And if you just think about what would your life be like, how would you perform at work, and even in your relationships, your patience with your children, if you had a full night's sleep every night, how would your life be? It would just be much better. Yeah.
The aspect of making everything a habit, I think, is the thing that a lot of people are struggling with. How do I make all these things stick? How do I, what do I do to meditate every day, or eat right, and it's a pattern that you have to establish over time, right? Any tips or tricks or anything that you found that specifically, you mentioned your smoothie, and that was like the go-to thing that like you did that, and that kind of spun everything else throughout your day. And I was wondering if there's any other tips or tricks that you've learned about, sticking with your new habits. Oh, and it froze. Can you hear me? Oh, there you are.
Well, I think the most significant thing I always tell people is, yes, I can hear you now.
We'll have to cut that.
Yeah, I think the most significant thing is to take it slowly. That's fine. Taking it slowly is probably the most important thing you can do, doing one thing at a time, because there is research showing that willpower is a limited resource. So when we try to take on too many things, we inevitably fail. And then that makes us feel bad about ourselves, and we want to give up. And so that, I think the most important thing to do is to take one small thing and to take it on and to do it fully until it's completely embedded as a habit. And the ways we can do that, we can write our goals down, and we can have something, a visual cue or a reminder to do that, have a list, and that sort of triggers our memory to do those habits until it becomes so part of your normal life that it's just there. For example, I have something like a gratitude practice once a week, and I put it in my calendar, and then every Monday morning it pops up, and then I see, okay, I need to do my gratitude practice. And now I don't really need the reminder any longer. When it gets to Monday, I realize, oh, I need to be grateful for what happened in the week before. And that's now become part of my life, as has the green smoothie that I initially resisted, and the meditation. So these things, you can take on one thing and then you go for a couple of months. But I wouldn't take on a whole bunch of them, particularly if you are quite stressed, because you tend to, you give up, and then all of your efforts are really in vain.
One of the things that I kind of I wrote down over here in my little notes about willpower and the importance of having, the willpower and grit are both enhanced when you surround yourself with positive influences, and probably influencers as well, people. And you talk about that in your book as well, how you try to like remove some of the negatives to kind of that would bring you down again. How is that? Are you still doing that, and have you changed anything? Adding on to that. But basically, the approach is like remove the negatives out of your life so they don't drag you down, right?
Yes, I am very focused on that, because I think I struggled with fatigue quite a lot when I was sick. So my levels of energy are really affected by the kind of people I spend my time with. So it affects me. So if I go out for a coffee with someone and they complain bitterly and everything's a problem and nothing's their fault and the world is out to get them, and I walk away from that and I feel like, poof, I feel drained. I can feel that, and I don't. So I'm very conscious about now spending time with the kind of people who have the same philosophies as me. So I really believe in accountability and owning your stuff and being a grown up and deciding I'm in charge of my life, and I'm going to talk about influences. I try to spend a lot more time with people who embrace that same thinking. And when I walk away from a lunch or a coffee with like that, I feel lifted. I feel inspired. I think, wow, they've taught me something. I'm feeling excited about, these other people are doing these interesting things. So that's the kind of effect that I try to sustain. And I am quite conscious of it. I am mindful of, there are people who in my life, you can't get rid of everyone who's a bit negative. So I just am more mindful of the people who drag me down, to spend a little bit less time with them. I tell them, I need to have I have an hour only, and then I have to go. Whereas I'll spend maybe 2 hours with someone who's really joyful and optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's that energy that's contagious when you walk into a room with positive people. It's almost like it just by osmosis you get some of that energy and it feels great. And conversely, it's the same thing with when you deal with people that maybe are just negative at that point in their life or just negative in general, and they're stuck, and then it feels like it drains your energy as well. And I certainly have experienced things like that.
Yes, there's a physiological answer to that, because there are specialist brain cells, and they're called mirror neurons. And what they do is even within 33 milliseconds of seeing an expression on someone's face, pick up that emotion and we absorb it. And it may happen on a subconscious level. It doesn't always very obvious, but you can tune into that and really exploit that more. So there is something, it's not just a feel, a vibe, or an intuition. Is actually your brain is responding to those around you, and it can be influenced by them. Yeah.
So do you actively seek out positive people now?
Yes, I do.
So one of the things that you do is workshops, and can you tell me a little bit more about that? The book is great. It gives you bullet points that kind of list everything out for you. It gives you contextual information that you can use to kind of understand the topics and connect them, which is great. What do you do in your workshops? How do you take that to the next level?
Okay, so my workshops are half. What I do is I start with all the theory about how stress can be beneficial, and how if we understand our physiology and all these different responses, we can learn to spot them and to look for opportunities. So I also then use a lot of opportunities to do exercises. So what people will then do is they will learn about all these different responses, and then they will spend a few minutes writing in a gratitude journal about how to, at a time when stress really helped them. It either helped them push towards a deadline, or they felt stressed, so they reached out and connected with a friend and deepened a relationship, something like that, where they can really appreciate what stress did for them. And those kind of exercises really then embed what I'm teaching in my book. So it's one thing to read a book, but to exercise, then you start to really apply it to your own life circumstances.
How long is the workshop? What does it take to kind of go through it and implement those items?
It's about a half day. So I start in the morning about 8:30 and we finish at about 1:30. And then there are takeaway exercises as well, because there's always people who really like to embrace everything. But as I said, it's not good to do too much at once. So they might want to take away a lot of exercises and do it in a more gradual approach. So they might try one thing a week or one thing a month going thereafter. And then, I offer them the support. So if they want to email me and say, well, I had trouble with this goal setting, or like that, or that didn't really work for me, is there something else that works better? And then we'll work on that. So it's really about a half day intervention, and then people can take it deeper if they're interested.
Right. I was thinking about, because you mentioned accountability, and surrounding yourself with a social network that supports you. And I was wondering, like, what do you do in the workshop to kind of help people? Because that's a lot of it is like we go to do some training, we were super excited about something, we do day one, day two, and then it's like, okay, going back to your old habits. And it seems that some of the ones that are like more successful are the ones that are kind of creating some kind of accountability system in which people check in or do something. Is there anything that you do? You mentioned emails, so anything else?
Yes. So I have, at the end of the workshop, they need to choose 3 interventions that they'd like to implement in their lives, and they make a commitment with a date and what they're going to execute. And then that's the part where they're accountable to me to follow up on those things, to make sure that they are really embedding what they promised into their lives. And there are people who also have, a life coach or someone like that, and then they will take those practices and work with their life coach as well, which also works really well because then you have regular follow-up and accountability.
The the aspect of using social networking tools, and technology in general, how double-edged that can be. On the one hand, and you talk about this in your book as well, which is we have access to this instant communication, like we're talking right now across thousands and thousands of miles, and it's amazing. And that can be the positive aspect of that, but at the same time you have all the social networking stuff that can be that is very positive as well, but then it can lead to other type of escapism, or
Yes.
getting yourself drawn in and drowned in all the social media stuff. How do we navigate, and what are your thoughts on how people can cope when they get stuck into reading their Facebook feed forever, or get stuck watching funny cats or stuff, cats on YouTube for hours, and losing track of everything? What are some of the things that you do to kind of sidestep that issue?
Okay, so you spoke also about influences. So one thing's important is how conscious we are of the kind of media we're allowing into our space. So I'm quite conscious in the same way that my energy in the physical world, I'm conscious of that. If I come across things on social media that are quite negative, or that are quite sort of about abuse, or things that I don't really like, animal cruelty and things, then I move away from that. And negativity about politics and things, I just move away from it. So that's one aspect. And then I also have tools that I have an iPhone, and what I do is I make use of the screen time app to limit my usage. So I limit mine to 30 minutes a day of social media. And then what that does is that when I get into bed at night and I'm sort of looking at my phone, which I shouldn't really be doing because it does interfere with your sleep, what that happens is that then my apps become disabled, and I have to push a button to ignore and override that, which I don't typically do because it's almost acts as a trigger. It's a reminder to say you've actually been on social media for 30 minutes today, and maybe it's time to sleep, or maybe it's time to read a book rather, or something. So that's the kind of thing I do to limit it. And of course, there's also the reporting, which is very interesting to have a look at. How many hours or minutes did I spend on social media on the various apps in the week? And that can be a bit of an eye opener, because it is a quite negative use of our time, really. I love it for business, and I use it for promoting my services and connecting with family overseas and things. But one doesn't need to be scrolling through the feed for an hour or two a day. I think there's more valuable things we can spend doing, like meditation and creativity and things.
Right. I found that the way I sort of keep accountability of the things that I need to do is using reminders on calendar. I literally put time, like I'll spend half an hour on Facebook or something to do whatever I need to do, half an hour to do this. And it literally is like an appointment. I found that doing like to-do lists for me without any specific delivery date or time, or when the time is going to be allocated for it, they kind of just grow and grow and grow. And in a sense, they become a stressor for me, because then I feel like it's like a never-ending list. You knock out 3 off your list, and there's 12 that just came on the bottom of it, and just kind of this perpetual thing that you use. It's like a treadmill of continuous tasking, and that can be demoralizing, because you just feel like I'll never be done with this. But if you put things on the calendar, I found that at least I'm like, okay, I know that I need to do these 2 or 3 things every day towards specific goals. I get to prioritize them and sequence them the way I want. They also feel, visually you see them on the calendar. You can space them apart so that you have, you're not being unrealistic, versus if it's just a to-do list, it's just kind of like this long list of things to do. And yes, it does feel great when you cross them out, but it also feels like it's like a never-ending thing, versus on a calendar, you can just kind of see, oh, here's how my week is going to look, and then the next week is next week, and I can always kind of shift things around. So that's kind of how I cope with things.
Yeah, that's great. And I think I love my calendar. I block out chunks of work when I know I'm going to be doing writing. I block out a chunk, and then I'm able to do what I enjoy doing. So I also use my calendar for managing my time. And I also have a paper list, which I love ticking items off, but I don't have this never ending list. I have a today list. And then at least I know, I try to be realistic, to put on, the 5 things that are really critical for today. And then, so that I don't get overwhelmed, because you can get stressed looking at your to-do list, and it just is never ending, as you say.
Right. And the other aspect of things that are stressing us out, in addition to just work. So that was kind of like a lot of work related stuff, right? Let's kind of step into relationships.
Yes.
That is something that, wow, there's just so much to learn and just so much to open up to. What are the top things that you found in your research were the top stressors in terms of like relationships?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are having, particularly the women that I interviewed, they're finding that their spouse is not doing enough of the childcare. They found, sort of not feeling supported and feeling disconnected. There were a lot of people who felt very lonely as well. So loneliness is a big one, and that came up in the survey quite a lot as well. And there were also a fair amount of conflicts with family members. One gentleman had a conflict with his mother, and he really struggled to find common ground. So those are the kind of difficulties and complexities in relationships. Some people, also were having a lot of trouble with things like an ex-wife or husband not really following through on the kind of morals that they want to embed with their child. So there were all sorts of conflicts around the childcare and divorce and separation. And just challenges with parenting, people with special needs children, and the overwhelming difficulty of trying to balance caring for one child and then the other child with the special needs, and trying to balance their needs. So those are the kind of difficulties that came up for the people I interviewed and researched.
Emotions are related closely to relationships, and
yes,
just speaking out of my own experience, the growth that as you get older and you learn more about yourself. And I remember myself in the 20s and not the 1920s, people. I'm not that old, but in my 20s, when you have a different worldview, you're more gung ho, you're more I'd say a control freak. I mean that's kind of how I interacted with the world. It was kind of me, how I can kind of get in my way, suppressing emotions in terms of, I'm a man, I can't, I'm not going to be affected by this.
Yeah.
It's just nothing. I'm just going to brush it off. And it feels like, nowadays we're getting more and more open. I think there's some kind of a renaissance going in which people are looking into emotions as, hey, this is an integral part of our life. We are cognizant of how exercising is beneficial for us. We're cognizant how food is beneficial to us, good food, right? Healthy food, and how feeding our bodies is affecting us and our brains. But then the emotions is like this red-headed stepchild that's just kind of like sitting on it, like, oh, that's just, let women deal with emotions.
Yeah.
We men, we know our
don't
stuff.
Deal with emotions.
Don't deal with emotions.
Yeah.
And so just out of my own experience, I, just kind of tapping into that and opening up and talking about things. My wife is a mental health counselor, so I'm kind of privileged in a way because I have I think she's kind of experimenting on me in some way. So maybe that's the source of improvement. Who knows? But it is an important topic to talk about. In your research, in your book, what are some of the things that that were, as you were researching this and emotions? Tell us like how. What are your thoughts on emotions? How they fit into the stressors, and how people can I guess learn more about that, and how to deal with it, and how to incorporate it in this whole plan of harnessing stress.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you about the, men not being able to show emotions and things. And I was quite, I was moved when I interviewed, said they really felt they wished they were more assertive, and they wished they were taller, and they looked like they wanted to come across as aggressive. They had a lot of self-doubt. And that was surprising for me, because I thought, as a woman, and, I always think, it's the women that are all, unsure of themselves, and the men look all out. deep down, we're all struggling with a certain aspect of ourselves. So that was really interesting. And I think a lot of people spoke about how they were things like overthinking and rumination. So when they have an incident with someone, a conflict at work, they just cannot go of these thoughts and playing the event over and over, and they're really grappling with these emotions. And I think many people are taught to squash them down, to not really feel deeply about them. So from the research I've done is that, a lot of the specialists advise to really allow us to feel the feelings, lean into it, absorb it, say, okay, I'm feeling anger and I'm allowed to feel anger. And of course, there's a difference between how you feel and how you behave. It's feeling anger is okay, hitting somebody. So that distinction becomes very important when feelings are completely allowed. And I think that, the research I've done and the learning about this has also influenced me as a parent. So when my child having a meltdown and crying and thrashing and saying, I'm so angry, I'm accommodating that. In the past, I would say, oh, I can't deal with this. This is just too overwhelming for me, the screaming and on. But now the way I parent is much more aligned to, okay, how is it, what emotion do you think you're feeling? What's going on there? Why do you think you're feeling that? What could you do, and how do you think that could have gone differently? And it's helped me parent in a different way, and hopefully by the time my kids get older, they're society in such a way that people are allowed to feel and they actually embrace what's going on with them. So I hope I've answered that question. I went on a bit of a ramble there.
I do it all the time, and that's why this podcast is unstructured in that way. We just talk, and people will get out of this whatever they will get out of it. In terms of emotions, and my wife always says something to the effect of, you are not your emotions, you have emotions.
Yes.
And so I think recognizing that is critical, because it is something that when you recognize, you can kind of deal with. It's kind of like ooh, I have anger in me right now. And if you notice that, even moment of noticing that is such a critical tool to deal with it. Because if you're just on this rampage, it just kind of feeds on itself, and then you're like, oh my gosh, what did I do? Then there's the regret, because you just kind of spun out of control. Do you have any
lashed out? Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any things that you do specifically when you it's a learned habit or skill, right, to kind of recognize that emotion before it's too late? Do you have anything that helps you do that?
Yeah, I think I identify the emotion is very important for me. So, if I'm thinking, okay, this is frustration, and then my question, what I always do is ask myself, why am I feeling this? Because I think we all have this natural knee-jerk response. So when we're feeling something that's difficult to deal with, what we want to do is we immediately want to reach for a crutch, and we numb the pain because it's hard for us to cope with it. And I think we all have a certain natural tendency. Some people reach for alcohol. Some people, will then scroll through their social media because they want to be distracted. For me, it's eating. So I like chocolate, and when I'm feeling like I've had a bad day or I'm particularly unappreciated, I reach for the slab of chocolate. And when I'm doing it, the most important thing that I'm telling myself is, okay, I'm now numbing the pain. I'm acknowledging this pain. I'm feeling something bad. And okay, this is anger. And I'm angry with so-and-so because this happened and I had an expectation. And then, I start to sort of rationalize, how could that, maybe I had an expectation that I didn't express. What would I have done if I were in their shoes? So I tried to sort of turn it around and analyze it from all angles as much as possible. I am quite a natural analyzer, and you can get quite stuck in that pattern. So it's not very healthy to stay there too long. So I'm also conscious of that. And what I find is, if I'm ruminating and going on and on and on, I have a bunch of tools that I talk about in the book, that then I need to do a nice bath with some salts, and I do all sorts of little rituals to try to get myself out of it. But as you say, I think the most critical thing is that awareness, and to name it and to say, okay, this is what I'm feeling and this is why I'm feeling it. and it's
Right.
allowed.
One of my notes over here, and you cite Brené Brown,
Yes.
who advises how to handle strong emotions by firstly well, identifying what are the feelings that we're having and
Yeah.
where do they come from, right? And then secondly, she says to figure out what brings you real comfort and renewal, and not just numbing. And
Yes.
you spend some time on this concept of like how we numb ourselves in this world, and there's like endless list of things that we can do, and let's talk about some of those and how you found different ways of kind of coping with those numbing practices that we all have.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think there's a number of them. And the first thing I want to say is that what's clear about what Brené Brown says, that she also says in one of her other books, I think, is that we all numb. So it's not that anybody's immune to it or has overcome this. So this is something we all do. We just have a different form. And it's not right, it's not wrong, and I don't bring judgment to it. So that was quite important in the interviews to talk to people about, what do you do, when you're feeling overwhelmed. And there was quite a mix of what people do. So a lot of the mothers spoke about having a very big glass of wine at the end of the day. They felt so overwhelmed with the pressures of work, plus rushing home, cooking a meal, bathing children, homework, the strain of getting it all done. And just after that, they just need some level of crutch. And that for many people was a big glass of wine. For the men, quite a few beers, and then in my survey, there were very few people who admitted recreational drugs, but I'm sure that's quite a common one for a lot of people. I think social media is quite a big one. We escape. So I write a lot in the book about escaping and what some people do. There's healthy and unhealthy ways of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
There's pornography, I suppose, a method of escape. Other people do things like reading and watching TV. And I think that's fairly tame, I think, a fairly harmless method of escaping. So what happens is when we're overwhelmed with some sort of, instead of continuing to feel the pain, we're just getting involved in the plot of some sort of a novel or a TV show. And that can be a good temporary distraction, as long as we still acknowledge the feelings that we're having. The one gentleman said he actually reads nonsense. So when he gets stressed out, what he does is he decides, he wants to learn about, how rocket fuel works. And then he will go on the internet and he will just dig as deep as possible into this topic just to clear his thinking about that. Quite fascinating, I think. And then what were the other crutches? Creativity and music were quite big. So some people found, doing a bit of drawing, knitting, or just kind of taking their mind off it by, your mind's busy thinking, in this blanket I'm making, which color am I going to use next, instead of why did my spouse treat me badly? That's a good way to move ourselves away from that negative space. So that's a more positive method of distraction and escape.
I think one of the things that came to me as I was reading the book on that specific topic of like how do we escape, how do we numb ourselves, is, it seems like everything is a question of balance, right? You can spend, let's say, half an hour on YouTube and watch something silly, or maybe something not silly that you just want to learn about and kind of distract yourself. It's the reeling back into, and not getting stuck in like watching 12 hours of YouTube or Netflix. It's great to kind of kick back and Netflix and chill. But then there comes the point when you're like, oh, wow, I've been watching this for 12 hours and now I'm drained. So now I'm going to eat something bad, and then you just spin out of control.
Yes.
So it's kind of like, again, maybe a reminder is what you need. Like, hey, you have an hour, and then it just kind of pings you, hey, you're done. You should do something else now.
Yes, exactly. And I think the gaming is also that's very dangerous. I think people fall into computer games and things, and that can get really all-consuming. And I know myself well. I stay away from gaming because once I'm in, I really struggle to pull myself out. And that's because the gaming releases the brain chemical of dopamine. And that's the chemical of action. So as soon as you get that little notification on your phone, it's like, oh, there's a message for me. And, oh, look, I have to feed my cows. And look, I have to fight the warriors. And there's another around and then there's just more and more and more. And that's the danger for me in terms of gaming. So I tend to stay away from things where I sucked in, because I know that it's not going to be an hour. Yeah.
The that is so true. But at the same time, I got to say that and I'm not a big gamer. I do appreciate games for what they can bring in, and I think this is another case of the same thing can be a poison and a cure. Like in small doses,
Yes.
it can be a beneficial thing. It can be a cure to things, and then when you overdose, it becomes poisonous to you. I see games
Yes.
as interesting tools that can bring in a lot of interesting ways of educating. I'm really into how gaming can be utilized for training, for teaching, but again,
Yes.
if you overdo it, if it's too much, and if it focuses on what you just said, which is like those dopamine hits, right? And it's just like, here's
Yes.
another shiny little thing, here's another thing, and just kind of draws you in.
Yes.
It becomes then at some point detrimental, and
Yes.
and so it's going to be how do we establish that pattern? How do we establish the ability of pulling ourselves out of that, so we don't get stuck and play games for a day or two or three endlessly? And
Yes.
and
Yes.
another thing that you brought
Yeah, I
in the
think
book. Mhm. Go ahead.
I think that comes with the a kind of knowing yourself more. So the older we get, I think, and the more, if you do invest in personal growth and you start to learn, oh, I see this pattern. This is how I tend to deal with conflict. This is how I tend to deal with pain. You start to recognize these things. And I think that is the first step. Awareness is always the first step. So as soon as you become aware, oh, I've been sucked into a game now and I've been here for 3 hours, this is not healthy, then you can start to make decisions that shift you away from that. I notice with my children, they don't have that awareness. They don't have that maturity yet. I have to be the one to say, right, the gaming time is over now, because their prefrontal cortex is not really developed yet. It's only developed by the time we're about 25. And that's the thing that helps us pull back and do the better thing in the long run than the short-term enjoyment.
I think I'm still waiting for my frontal cortex to fully develop.
Well, you are a man after all, so I mean, you can't expect much.
we're a little delayed. I think those external reminders that we can set for ourselves to kind of pull ourselves out of those patterns is the key. At least that's what I found working for me.
Yeah.
There's a lot of those distractors, and we can totally lose ourselves nowadays. And it's important to see how those can be in small doses, can be fine, and then can become stressors on their own. If
Yes.
just kind of left unchecked. There's a huge there's a lot of issues with dependencies right now. People struggle with a lot of different, and it's not even like you think of classical dependencies like drugs or alcohol, things like that. There's just so much more right now because we have all this media, all this content that we can consume from anywhere, anytime, for as long as we want, free. And that's just an easy way to kind of get sucked into that vortex. And so it's important for
Yes.
people to kind of build these patterns, these habits of trying to figure out by themselves, like, hey, like a little alarm going off, like, oh, I've overdone it. Somehow I need to kind of focus on
Yeah.
something else.
Yes.
Okay, so what were the third thing we were talking about out of the major ones? Money. Let's talk about money.
Yeah. Yeah.
What did you
Yeah.
find in that space in
Yeah.
terms of stress and how to cope with what money can bring in as a stressor?
Yes, I think a lot of people were struggling with the day-to-day expenses and with worrying about the long-term savings. So I'm not clear on the stats in the United States, but in South Africa, 95% of people don't have enough savings for retirement, which is
Wow.
really alarming considering we don't have a strong social system. So we have very high tax, but we don't have a good, social services when you retire. So we really do need to be putting money away. And I think one of the things that that emerged in my research that I was very surprised about was that it seems to be a struggle with the people who have elderly parents who are then dependent on them because they have inadequate savings. And not only that, but they also have teenagers or maybe young adults who are still studying, living at home. So on both ends, they're supporting the other generations, and that means that they don't have enough to put aside, which then perpetuates the cycle of them becoming dependent on their children when they get there. So that was quite alarming in terms of the stats. And so in terms of some of the solutions were things like we pay off our most expensive credit as soon as possible. And in interviewing, I interviewed a couple of financial advisors. And what they were saying is that people avoid it. It's one of those things that, I know I don't have enough, but I just don't want to deal with it. So I'm just going to avoid it and not talk about it. But they find that a lot of their clients, as soon as they have that meeting and they make some sort of a plan and they say, I'm going to put a small, tiny amount aside every month, they feel this dramatic sense of relief. Some people even cry. They feel so relieved. They've been worrying about this underlying stress all along that they don't have enough. And in taking action, it tends to alleviate that stress. So I would recommend to anyone listening, if you do have financial difficulties, it's really important to meet with an advisor who can make some sort of a plan. And what they also have often is they have things like tools to help you budget. They put together a monthly budget for you instead of blindly spending and not knowing where the money's going, to monitor and measure and then address it. So it's always this topic of accountability and taking action so that we own the things that we're busy with. Those things are really powerful in terms of overcoming your financial difficulties and really most of life's challenges.
As I was reading through that chapter in the book, I was like, "Wow, she's getting into money. That's a topic for like several books right there." And of course, you can talk about like different financial advice and what people can do in order to kind of cope and plan. But I think is what you just said right now is critical, which is make some kind of a plan, even if it's tiny little steps that you do. At least you know that you're doing something towards that, and that's going to give you that peace of mind, or at least something that's going to say like, "Hey, I'm doing something about that," and you're not. Because stress is, like the way I found out, with me is like a lot of it is stress is overt, which is like there's a direct stressor that affects you. But there's also a lot of those undercurrent types of stresses, which are kind of like sitting in behind your, in the back of your mind, and you may not consciously be aware of them, but they are still kind of gnawing at you, and then you're like, wow, why do I feel the way I do? So it seems like just making some kind of progress, some kind of steps towards dealing with that issue is going to help you with that subconscious part of having that stress kind of like in the background. And anything else?
Removed, yes. About the money, not really, but just thinking about the environmental stress is quite interesting. We have quite a different culture here in South Africa, and we have very high unemployment rates, and we have a lot of political stress. So we have things like corruption in government and a lot of inefficiency. So when you go to renew your passport, it's really a challenge. So these small things that should work quite simply do not work. And that contributes also to our level. And because there's such unemployment, there's also high levels of crime. So what we find is in our households, we really have to fortify ourselves. We've got multiple layers of security, very high fences. We have electric fencing. We have an internal alarm, an external alarm. And we live with this current of, well, I might be attacked. My family might be attacked really any day. And that can add significant stress. And as you say, it's one of those undercurrent stresses that we're not really aware of that's lingering in the background.
I can only imagine how, that can be affecting people, which is, something that not only I have to deal with my daily, stuff, now I have something like physical security, which is that kind of, basic need for people on Maslow's, I guess, hierarchy. And so just
safety, security.
Safety and security in there, right? So if you don't have that as your kind of foundation of life, then everything else is kind of like secondary. And so I can imagine how stressful that might be. So I don't know. I guess what do you do about that? It's just, I guess, physical security. You mentioned alarms and just your regular stuff that you can do to kind of protect yourself.
Yes, you put in as much as you can, and then the rest you really have to surrender to whatever's going to happen is going to happen, and also making wise choices. For example, in the States, you wouldn't go walking in Central Park at midnight, really. You just try to stay away from dangerous areas and, be sensible about where you shop and how you live, and also warn your children. We have to really guide our children to say you don't speak to strangers, and really reinforcing the fact that we need to know where they are, and things like that. Yeah, that's all you can really do.
So you mentioned something that's going to be a great segue to the next part, which is going to be a little bit tapping into more philosophical aspects of this, which is you mentioned living in the present, right? So being present,
yes.
Living in the moment. It is what it is. Que sera, sera. We are what we have in front of us, and that's what's happening right now. And a lot of it is, a lot of people carrying things from their past, the burden that's affecting them stress-wise, and then projecting into the future, again, is another way of kind of keeping yourself constantly busy with more and more stress. But living in the moment, talk to me about how you kind of practice that, and what are your thoughts on being present?
Yeah, I think that's changed for me a lot. Before I got sick, I was really quite a high achiever. I would be chasing the future, thinking I've got these goals and I'm gonna, achieve all these great things. And I was always chasing something. And I had a lot of difficulty being in the moment, just sort of enjoying what's there. I also spent a lot of time thinking about the past and what should have been, and really, when you realize that it's adding no value to you, then you start to make that shift. And I think meditation for me was almost a tool to move me into a state of mindfulness. And I would say that practicing a lot of yoga has also done that for me. So I'm very clear now, when I'm in my body, I'm in this current moment, I'm enjoying what's happening right now. And I have also I'm able to reinforce this very well with my children. My youngest daughter is 8 years old, and she's one of these people who loves, she loves going out, and she loves friends and family and people coming over, and she's constantly saying, who's coming tomorrow, and what are we doing next, and what are the plans, make plans all the time. And she struggles to really be in the moment, and often she asks for something, she can't wait for something, but when it's happening, she's not enjoying it because she's talking about what's happening tomorrow. And I often have to say to her, can you just enjoy what's happening now? I'm cuddling you right now in this moment. This is a beautiful moment. We're connecting and we're cuddling and we're having a wonderful connection. So trying to embed that in my children is also part of, it reinforces it for me in my life as well, because it helps me to appreciate the moment I'm enjoying with them. Instead of, I think a lot of people, their children move out and they have that empty nest and they realize, oh, I missed all those moments and I wasn't really focused on it and I wish I could have it back. But, I'm trying to make the most of them when I'm with them. Yeah.
My wife mentions that to me all the time when I'm preoccupied with something else and not playing with our daughter. And she's like, you're going to be missing those moments. You know it. I'm like, I know you're right.
Yes.
I know you're right. It's so you have to take stock in like, hey, I need to carve out that time, and not that I need to, like I want to. It's just time management.
Yes.
Being in that present moment, and especially through like meditation, if you can do that, kind of disconnect from like what was in the past and what's going to happen in the future, definitely can bring a sense of peace. And it's a wonderful thing if you practice it. So meditate,
Yes.
people, meditate.
Yes, and I think also I have moments where I used to work in this high, senior position, and I had all this really heavy responsibility. And now I feel the life that I lead is really quite, it's quite quiet and still. I work alone at home quite a lot if I'm not doing workshops or seeing clients. I get to write, in my favorite place, in my sanctuary. And so I love to indulge in the moment. And sometimes what I do at lunchtime is I make my lunch at home and I walk on the grass barefoot. I just decide, well, I'm just going to really just be here, and I feel the sunshine on my face and I really absorb it. And it sounds quite quite out there, like I'm a hippie or something. But I am still an A-type person, but I really make sure that I'm enjoying these beautiful moments, because I remember back to when I wasn't enjoying it. It was awful and I hated every moment. So I'm just grateful so often for those beautiful moments of that, sun on your face and feet on the grass. It's actually quite a special experience.
I think the skill of recognizing your own thoughts and kind of seeing them as almost like separate objects can be helpful. And you talk about that in your book. One of the bullets that you mentioned over here is, develop metacognition as the practice of listening to your thoughts and becoming aware of your beliefs. How are you practicing that, and how is that helping you out, practicing metacognition? How does that work?
Yeah, so I think historically I was very hard on myself when I used to be very driven and pushing towards my goals. I really beat myself up quite a bit. And I think the most significant moment, I think, when we hear our thoughts is when we've done something wrong. So if we mess up and make a horrible mistake or fail, then our self-talk often becomes very negative. And that's when I can hear, you're a loser and you messed this up and you're never going to be this. And, we start to hear these thoughts. And when we become aware of that, it's a pretty important moment, because it helps us to start to shift and to move that into a better place. Without hearing it, you can't take any action. So as soon as I became aware of, actually, wow, I'm quite hard on myself. I wouldn't speak to my children like that, and I would hate it if someone spoke to me that way. So I start to become aware of, okay, that's what I'm doing. And when I make a mistake or I have failed at something, I'm very cautious to speak to myself kindly. I make a real an effort, a conscious effort to say, okay, that didn't go well. Everybody makes mistakes. Things go badly sometimes. It's actually okay, because it doesn't mean it's every time. It's not always. It's actually just one moment. And, there's a scope for improvement and doing better next time. Let's take the lessons and let's absorb them, and let's move forward with grace and with learning. So that's how to myself, as if I'm talking to a child. My child, I wouldn't call them an idiot and a moron and a screw up or anything. I wouldn't talk to my children like that. So then I try to make sure I'm not talking to myself in that way. So that helps a lot, to have a child in front of you to realize how they would feel and how they would respond when you had that level of negativity at them.
So this is in a way we're talking about self-compassion, right? How to
Yes,
talk to
yes.
yourself, how to treat yourself, and I think everybody had that in their life when they are just beating themselves up, right? They're like, I really sucked at this or like that, and
Yes.
and that may feel good, as in a sense that, I'm taking that out on someone, but it's actually the opposite, because then you're literally are bringing yourself down, and you feel like, I can't do anything. It's just kind of you're drowning in that self destructive pattern. And
Yes. Yeah. And what's fascinating for me that I learned is that the research shows that there is an inverse relationship with self-compassion and stress. So that if we have high levels of self-compassion, we're kind to ourselves, we have low stress levels. And the opposite is true. If we have low levels of self-compassion, we're unkind, our thoughts are negative and harsh on ourselves, then our stress levels tend to be very high. So if we can learn it, and self-compassion is a skill, if we can learn self-compassion, that is actually a method of stress management, a very productive one. So that motivated me to realize I need to shift my thinking and my self-talk into a much more positive way, so that I can be more positive with my stress and lower my stress appropriately.
So is there a I think people can recognize that, it's not good when they're talking, badly to themselves about themselves and beating themselves, up over things. But again, it's like a process. Like, how do you catch that? How do you, like, what is a practical aspect of trying to kind of intercept that and say, oh, wow, I'm doing this negative thing right now. I should be self-compassion. I should be, caring about myself and putting myself in that space of, love, or just like, hey, okay, let's learn from this. Let's move on, and let's not dwell on it in a negative way. How do you kind of capture that moment when people are doing that on autopilot? I think that's one of the biggest things when people have, like, what are the tools that we have in order to intercept that, right? So what are your thoughts on how we could potentially do that?
Yes, it's not an easy thing. That's the first thing I want to say, that metacognition is very difficult and it doesn't come easily. It takes quite a lot of practice and learning. And I think for me, what I noticed, the first thing I noticed was, I think, and this is really a thing for me to say out loud, but I thought that I was learning this quite well. And then my kids started saying negative things about themselves, but the way they said it, it sounded like the kind of thing that I would say. So I must have said that, when they say things like, be a success at this, or I'm terrible at something, when they say, oh, I'm terrible at drawing. And I realized, oh, maybe I've been saying things like, I'm terrible at sales, or I'm terrible at, whatever it is. And I recognized almost the pattern of words that sounded very much like the kind of thing. So I said, wow, even without being aware of it, I've been saying these things about myself. My children absorb them, and now they're doing that too, which becomes their internal dialogue and something their metacognition patterned by what I've done. So that was very sobering for me to start to realize that. And I have also myself out loud saying a few things like, oh, I'll never be a success at this, or, things like, and sometimes it comes from our condition of our parents. And I think things like, I started to become a writer after doing this other profession that made me so sick. And then I had all these doubts, and I kept saying, I'll never make money writing. Writers don't make money. And that's quite a limiting thing to say if that's become your new profession. So I started to say it out loud, and then my kids also challenged me on that to say, well, Mom, this is your passion. This is what you love. And I realized that, why am I repeating such a negative thing? Because it's embedding it for them. It's embedding it for me. And so, so for me, to answer your question, the first thing is I recognized the kids, and I realized that I must have been saying that. So it was really subconscious. The second thing was that I had verbalized it, and I caught myself. And then on the third level, then you really start to listen to your thoughts. So then, I did a speech recently, and it didn't go well. And I came home and I just thought, that was a disaster. And that's the kind of thinking that I had, that was a mess. And then I caught so quickly, because I realized, okay, this is a failure. This is one of those negative moments that I need to then step back and say, okay, it didn't go well, but what can I learn, and what could I do for something next time? And it's that owning it, to say, well, I'm not going to blame anyone. I'm not going to say it was the organizer or the environment. It's my responsibility to get this stuff right. I'm accountable. What action steps am I going to take? So next time, maybe I will speak with me so that I can, make sure I can be heard. Those little things like that, I can learn from it. So I've really, I've got into that pattern, and I can't say I always get it right, but there are moments where I'm able to really self-correct and put it on a more positive map. Yeah.
So what happened? What happened in the speech? I want to say two things before I forget. One is, people have kids. It will bring in another aspect of your life that you never knew existed. Your kids will be a perfect sounding board, your external subconsciousness, in a way. What Kathy said is that, she noticed patterns of the way she was talking to herself, and kids were kind of repeating. And that's what they do. They mimic. They learn by mimicry, right? They mimic what you do, what you say, what you do. So you have to be very careful. That's one thing that I've learned as a parent that is just paramount. It's unbelievable. And they are very, very good listeners. They will pick up things that you will be like, what, where did you, and then you're, oh my gosh, that's me. And so,
yeah.
So you got to be careful, because, you have to be mindful of what you're doing. But two, when you see that bouncing back, that, they're your soundboard, it's kind of like, ooh, it's coming back. Like, maybe that's what I'm doing to myself, because I'm kind of outputting that out there. So that's definitely.
Definitely, yeah.
But then tell me about, so what happened? So what happened in that speech that you think, now doing a little postmortem, analysis, little lessons learned. So tell me, I'm going to put you on the spot over here totally because, how did you cope with that stress and how did you harness it? How did you analyze it and how did you recover from it?
Yes. Okay. So I was hired. I was paid to do a speech, and there were two other speakers, and I don't think they weren't really professional speakers. And the venue was at a restaurant that was kind of outside. And it all started out quite well. And there was another gentleman, and he seemed very nervous. So when the host said, "Okay, who's going first?" I said, "Would you like to go first?" Because I could see that he looked quite nervous. And then off he went, and he did his speech. And he's a guy with this loud, booming voice, and he did his thing. And then it was my turn. But by the time he had finished with his talk, and it went on quite long. So, it was quite a long, like 30 minutes or something. The restaurant had filled up quite a lot, and there was a coffee machine behind me, and there was a very loud and rowdy table to our right. And these people were having a big party, and they were singing and carrying on. So then I'm busy trying to talk about stress and cite all the research and all this meaningful stuff that's quite serious. And then I found with the coffee machine frothing this noise and this other table like laughing and whatever, I really struggled for the people to hear me. And I was shouting. So it's not nice to shout. It's hard to get your point across in an eloquent way. And a lot of the detailed material, I had chunks of my talk that can be reused, but the nuggets that was really customized to the audience, I struggled to say. I think I left a lot of them out because I was quite rattled by the environment. And then it got to the end of the talk, and people asked a few questions, but the people in the back couldn't hear anything by then, so they were just talking amongst themselves. And I really felt quite deflated. I felt like these people paid me and deliver my best. I should have taken a mobile microphone and speaker so that I could make sure my message was heard and that I could feel calm. So I tried to have the deep breathing, and I realized I was getting quite stressed out. But so I powered through and I finished it off. But in looking back at it, when I sat down, I felt like, wow, I don't think I addressed. So I didn't really drive home the point very clearly in terms of how that element of stress was applicable to them and their environment. So I felt that I almost didn't meet the brief, and I'd let my client down. So that didn't feel good. I felt really like a failure, and then they gave me a little gift, and then I felt, oh, I've been paid and I've got a gift and I've messed it up. Oh, it was awful. Anyway. Yeah.
Well, a lot of it sounds
so then
like
when I went
environmental.
Home, yeah, but I should have been prepared. I should have had, well, how can and I realized that, a lot of speakers will have equipment with them that they can just use in that event. I do have a portable speaker. I could probably have pulled something together. Mm-hmm. But it's always those lessons. Those were the lessons I try to pull out of it to say, well, how could I avoid that happening again, so that I don't feel that level of stress. But I did indulge in. I binge watched Netflix for about 4 hours when I got home. I escaped and I numbed the pain, and you do all these wrong things, and I knew I was doing it, but I felt like, okay, I just need to escape for a bit. And then after that post-mortem, I started to realize, okay, this is what I could have done differently.
Right.
Yeah.
Were you as it was happening and you were getting stressed out that, hey, these people in the back, they can't hear me and all of that. What you mentioned breathing, right? So breathing, critical thing to kind of like conscious deep breathing. You mentioned a very interesting exercise in your book about breathing through like one nostril at a time, kind of switching left and right. I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was like, well, that's interesting. Let me try that. And I think it's just.
Did you try it?
I did right away. I was like, I'm like literally in bed. It's midnight, and I'm like, I'm like this, and my wife is like, "What are you doing?"
That's great. I'm so glad at least one reader's doing that.
And I think so. Here's my analysis of that. I think that because we breathe. We don't control our breathing like for the most of the time, right? Most of the time it happens automatically unless you're like super conscious and you hold your breath or a specific way of breathing. But I think the mechanics of like closing one of your nostrils and kind of alternating that, I think it just brings that focus on it. I don't know what your take on that is, but it's like I found it was like, wow, it's like I'm just kind of like mechanically inducing a pattern, and it just focuses me on that specific activity. And so how did you learn about that? I was like super. I was like, I got to ask Kathy about that. It's like, how did you learn about that, and why does it even work? Why is this good?
I don't know the science about how it works, but I think you're onto something about just bringing that focus to what's going on in and that's your parasympathetic nervous system in action. So that's pushing you out of your fight or flight mode, rest and digest. It's moving you into that state of calm. So that one came from Emma Seppala's book. So she's got a book called The Happiness Track. And she's a world-renowned expert on meditation and mindfulness and happiness. So she does a lot of breath work. She's done a lot with the US veterans, actually, a lot of interventions in terms of practices like yoga and breathing exercises to help with their post-traumatic stress. So she's had a lot of success in using simple things as breath work to deal with that level of complex stress. So if it can work with veterans of war, I reckon it can work to calm us down before a speech or in a meeting when we're feeling a bit stressed. So I do the belly breathing. I do that. I push my belly out and I do deep breaths, particularly before I do a speech or at a moment, before my workshops and things, just to bring me into that moment and that state of calm, into my body. I want to be in the moment instead of worrying about what's going to happen in half an hour or in the future. So that it brings the mindfulness, it brings the calming of the autonomic nervous system. So I do use those tools myself, although that alternate nostril one I haven't used an awful lot. It's not very practical in a public setting, put it that way. But it's good for you. You can do it in the bathroom before you speak and that. Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
Oh gosh, I found that really funny because it's silly, and I think I'm in that mode right now where I kind of choose silliness over like being overstressed by seriousness anytime. Yeah. And I think that was like, hey, what are you doing? Well, I'm de-stressing right now. Here's how I do it. So, but that was a very practical thing, and that kind of touches on what else you cover in your book, which is you talk about like at the beginning of the book you talk about like what stress is, and you link it up to like body functions, the systems that we have in our body, and how stress affects all of those things. So you get the mechanics to understanding the underpinnings of like what's happening when a stressful response is actually happening. But the title of a book is Harnessing Stress. So that makes me think, like initially when I thought about that, I was like, okay, so how do we turn a stress into a friend in a way, right? And we do need stress in our lives. Without stress, we wouldn't have many things. We wouldn't progress at all because it would be just like, Netflix and chill. So how do you? So what are some of the things that you found how you can harness stress? To kind of maybe push yourself forward or kind of recover from something. How stress is a positive thing?
Yes, I think, and there's beautiful research showing that the nations with the highest index are the ones with the highest GDP and the best, productivity and happiness, well-being and longevity. So people actually live longer when they experience these bouts of acute stress. So I think the most fascinating thing I learned that really transformed my thinking was learning about the challenge response. So that means that we're having a stress response, but our brains and bodies actually know that we're about to achieve something. And I think most people have felt that feeling when they're approaching a deadline, for example, and they feel there's kind of an anxiety feeling. They feel pushed and pumped. And when they look back, they realize, wow, I actually accomplished so much. I really delivered an awful amount in that short time. And that is really a stress response. And we're often told about, fight or flight is so bad, and there's saber-toothed tigers involved, and all of this, we haven't evolved. And I don't think that's true. I think the fight or flight response saves our lives, but we can't be having that all the time. What we are having a lot in a work context is something like the challenge response, where we're really feeling that push to deliver. We got that little, anxiety feeling to push us towards our deadlines and our goals. And I think I've learned to appreciate that now. So what happens before I'm doing a speech is that I feel these butterflies, and then I realize, this is challenge response. this is a good thing, because without this, I will struggle to be at my best. My thinking is clear, my brain is functioning well, blood flow is moving around to optimize how I'm about to perform. This is a good thing. And when
I'm
we learn
alive.
to embrace, and yeah, I'm alive and I'm about to do something important. And that's exactly one of the definitions that the stress researchers talk about. They say stress is what happens when something we care about is at stake. And if we didn't care about it, it wouldn't create stress for us. And that's the kind of coaching I also give my children. My oldest daughter does dancing exams, and she often says to me, "Mommy, I'm scared," before. And I say to her, well, that's good, because this is your body showing you that it matters. You've prepared for it. It's important. You want to do well. You care about it. And I'm really proud about that, because if you didn't care, I wouldn't be proud, So I try to reframe it for her in a way that shows her, oh, okay, something's going on in my body that shows me this is really meaningful for me and I want to do well. And that's how I've learned to embrace stress. And I do have moments where I'm feeling, oh, wow, I think I'm feeling negative stress now. This is getting too much. I'm overwhelmed. I'm unhappy. And then I do have that awareness to think, okay, well, this is not going to last forever. This is short-lived. It's a little peak of acute stress. It will go away. And I know in the reading I've done that little peaks of acute stress is actually quite good for us on the whole. So I like to use my mental, gymnastics around what's going on for the stress response now that I've learned so much about it. And that is how personally for me, I've learned to harness stress. So that's, I think, quite useful for me in my life.
Mm-hmm. I've heard someone say about stress that, kind of shifting perspective on it as well. When they, let's say, go on stage and will deliver some kind of, speech, and they feel that nervousness because, yes, like you said, things matter. You want to present what you want to present. You want to deliver. You want to add that value. You want to do a good job.
Yes.
But I heard that their coping mechanism was treat that emotion, that feeling of stress as excitement. Because sort of stress and excitement physiologically are very similar. Just kind of pumps blood everywhere. It kind of moves, synapses are firing faster. You got that adrenaline going. You got all of that happening. But you have that, if you have that negative connotation of stress, that, stress is something that can freeze, like freeze me on stage, or can,
I'm going to blow it.
Yeah.
That's not good. That's not positive.
Right.
Is that exactly that reframing it as excitement is exactly what one of the research studies offered. So I think there were a group of students and they split them into two groups. And the one group, they told them that what they're feeling in their stomach, that anxiety, that's actually excitement. And you keep telling yourself that's excitement because I'm looking forward to it and I want to achieve. And the people who were in that group compared to the control group actually objectively performed better, and they felt less stressed and their stress markers were reduced. So actually it's not just a trick. It actually does reduce the level of stress you're feeling when you tell yourself that's excitement instead of stress.
The matter of the aspect of shifting your perspective on something is I think is a key skill that people should invest time in learning about and practicing in their life. I think just having that tool in your tool set where you are struggling with something or facing something, and having that thing like, oh, let me look at this from a different perspective. Let me shift this around. Let me look at it from that perspective. Get some feedback. I think that is such a tremendous tool to kind of have in your tool set and utilize it. And the same is with stress, kind of looking at stress. Yes, it's something that is going to affect me. But if you recognize it almost as a separate entity, as a process that's happening in your body, then you can actually do something with it, as opposed to like, oh, I'm stressed, as if like, I have a yellow T-shirt right now. It's like part of me. It's like, no, it's just an item that sits on top of you or in you, but it's not you. It's just a process. And if you have that recognition, that awareness of it, you can do. And I think the same goes with a lot of emotions. You have to have that ability of being aware of those things. And when you recognize it, you can actually do something with it.
Yes, I think that's very powerful. I think what happens a lot for people is people get overwhelmed with stress and they believe, oh, the more this is damaging me, I'm getting, and they're fearful. There's a lot of fear around, if I get stressed, I'm going to get sick and this is bad for me. And how do I escape this? So all of that thinking is not very positive. It's not a resilient way to tackle stress, of away from stress. It's pervasive. It's part of everyday life. It's going to arrive. So is adversity. You know, you have these terrible challenges in your life that you struggle with. But if you and stress is always riding along with any kind of it. But if we are able to transform our thinking around it, that enables us to be a lot more resilient and to be able to ride that wave and get to the other side more efficiently and feeling stronger at the end of it.
Yeah, I can't find this this note that I took, but in your book you mentioned something about kids who are exposed, who have parents who are, you know, they discipline,
parenting.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that?
So this was
I
in
found that
Angela
super interesting.
Duckworth's book. Yeah, this was in her book called Grit, and she writes about how there's different styles of parenting, and those parents who are a combination of demanding and supportive. So they push their children. They don't allow them to just do whatever they want. They have high expectations, but they also support them. Those are the children that thrive the most, because they're actually driven to do something meaningful. They're not just, you know, if they perform badly, their parents don't just say that's all right, you know. They say, well, we think you can do better, and we're expecting a little bit more. And those are the parents that perform better at school and are a lot happier and more resilient, able to tackle challenges in life. So that I thought was quite beautiful, because I'm quite tough on my kids too. I have high expectations. I want them to take responsibility for the mistakes they make and what they do. And but of course, there's a lot of love in the background too. There's no questions.
Yeah, I think that's an example of stress being used in a positive way, like parents being demanding, and you know, I'm being a parent and being kind of cognizant of that, how I can kind of draw that boundary between pushing my child so that she, you know, she has this place where she can fail and she can learn from it, versus kind of like having that, oh, you know, kind of transference of like, oh, you're not performing well, and kind of put that in a context of negativity, or like, oh, this sucks when you fail.
Yes.
Well, no, we all fail, and the strength actually comes from like learning from it, and so that chapter in the book was, or that, you know, part of the chapter really spoke to me, because it kind of illustrates again how stress can be a positive thing, and how harnessing those moments and learning from them can be super beneficial for kids as well.
Yes, I think that's very important. One of the most commonly spoken lines in our household are allowed, because they have high standards like me. They get with themselves, they make, and they say mistakes are allowed. Mistakes are allowed. And when I mess up, I do something wrong, they love that. The kids think that's absolutely fantastic when I do something wrong. And I say to them, well, you know, mistakes are allowed. I mess up too. You know, it's okay. It's human.
Right.
You know.
Yeah,
don't cover it up. Don't pretend, and don't put on that happy face, that mask, like nothing ever goes wrong at work, because you do have bad days and it's real. And they need to know that.
Right. So what is next for you? So you have a book on burning out. And so I haven't read that one. So that's next on my list. And you know, you pack so much information in this book, in this current book, in harnessing stress, that it will take some time to unpack, but it's I really appreciate it, because it's like a compendium of knowledge, just kind of compressed into one place, and so it gives people a lot of different perspectives and different opinions and different inputs from different authors and subject matter experts and research. So it's very comprehensive. So I'm super excited about like what your next book is going to be about, and can you talk about that?
Yes. Well, I have two, and almost like a personal kind of project. My grandmother is 94 years old, and she has a lot of wisdom, and she's very memorably excellent. So her and my grandfather were married for 69 years. They had a wonderful love story. And, you know, she's obviously approaching the end of her days, and I'm not sure how much longer she will be here. So my next project, which I'm hoping will just be for a couple of months, is to write a short about the love of my grandparents and what life was like for them, without social media and all these expectations that we live now, and what her lessons are, what her advice is for young people, as to how to live a good life and what the important things. So that's really kind of a family project that I'd like to hold on to her legacy and their love story for future generations. I thought I'll bring my gifts, to the family to offer what I've got. And then the second project that I've been thinking of, I'm not quite sure on how this will work, is that many people have asked me, how do you recover? So it's all good and well. My first book's called Avoiding Burnout. If you didn't avoid it and you got into the state of health that I did, how do you get out? Because it's a very frustrating place to be, a long time to heal. And I did a lot of things. And as we spoke about, it was very holistic. I approached the spiritual side, the physical, mental, and healing. All of that, I think, is really, it's quite. So I want to drive home the point of that healing is really, it's not a take one pill and you will be better. There's no silver bullet. It's about healing the whole in the entire person and fix life, kind of like I did. So not that I have all the answers, but I think a lot of people could maybe gain learning from my journey of recovering and getting well. And just as you say about harnessing stress, I want to thank you for your great feedback, and that the book, it will be quite challenging for everybody to adopt every strategy. But my thinking was, well, here's your platter or your buffet meal that you could choose from. You can go and you can say, oh, I like a bit of that and a little bit of this, and that's going to work for me in my life. And then do that. So I never tell people, I'm not really prescriptive what people should or shouldn't do, because everybody's life is different and everybody has unique situation. So, but I do think the journey that I walked through as to how I got myself out of that terrible state of health into being as wealthy and healthy as I am now might be an interesting story for people. So that might evolve as I go with my little family project, but that's what's next, I think.
That was one of the other things that I appreciated about your book, in which you lay out all these different ways of dealing with stress and opening up quite a few new doors for me in terms of like different techniques and different ways of dealing with stress. But also you said, which is what you just said right now, which is everybody's different. Here's a tool set, and you choose the tool that works for you best, right? And that is, I found that to be so true in many other aspects of life, whether it's food or, or coping with things. There are different things that you can do. The book is telling you about a lot of them, and you can basically choose and test what works best for you. And I think that's the right kind of balanced approach, which is kind of, sort of like the golden, medium somewhere in there. And that's what it seems like life in general is about. It's like, how do we balance things out? It's not just like you said, prescriptive. Here's a pill, or here's one thing you should do. You should just do that one thing, and then your life is going to be perfect. It's just not. It just doesn't work like that. Yeah. Everybody's different, right?
No.
So.
Yes, yes. And as you say, the balance is really important, trying to balance what works. Some people are very stressed and very busy. So telling them that they need to meditate for 2 hours a day is viable for the average person. If you can, wow, that's really an amazing gift you'll give yourself. But it's not going to work. And that's really the underlying theme. Most of my books is around finding what works for you, and adapting your journey with just a few little nuggets of wisdom that I've collected, and I'm really happy to share.
Mm-hmm. Well, the book is very in depth in terms of covering a lot of different things, and then it's a perfect jumping point for like jumping into the other books that you reference if you want to dive deeper. So it's like a nice, like you said, buffet yes. of tools and techniques to get you started, and then you can dive even deeper by going into those referenced books. I can't wait for you to read your first book. I think it's a super important topic as well. About burnout. I think a lot of people are kind of like burning candle at both ends, and they know it. And so maybe that's going to be the topic of our next podcast. After I finish reading that one,
that would be wonderful. Yeah,
I would love to invite you again and talk about how to deal with burning out and your journey and how you recovered. And then by then, maybe you'll have some little previews for us, little teasers for your following book about recovery.
For the next book, yes. Yes, absolutely. Let's hope so. I love writing. I cannot stop writing. It's what I found my passion finally. And I am always going to be writing something.
Fantastic. Kathy, thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed this. I think we could talk for I think we talked about for almost 2 hours right now, which I think is a good testament to how well this may work in terms of unstructured conversation and just talking about this. Thank you so much for writing this book and the other book. And I hope to see you again on the show, and we'll be in touch. And in the meantime, keep me updated if there's anything that's going to come your way that you feel like it's worth sharing with the public, with my audience. I'm going to be building out pages where we're going to be capturing some of these things so people can listen and watch and also read about some of those things. And then I'll point them to your website and where they can learn more about your work and your workshops and upcoming books. So thank you again. Everyone who's watching this or listening to this, we were talking about Harnessing Stress, a book by Kathy Mann, and it's I highly recommended. Check it out. It's full of very, very well-researched techniques about stress and how to cope with it and how to harness it. And until next time, thank you for being with us, and talk to you then.